welcome once again to the Radical Imagination. I'm your host, Jim Vredos, and I'm a sociologist at John Jay College here in New York City. All this month, we've been commemorating our first year anniversary of the Radical Imagination on MNN, Manhattan Neighborhood Network. It's fitting to end the month's celebration with a past guest who brings an analysis and understanding of a crucial component in our attempts to imagine and develop a more just and humane world. As you might imagine, our many guests over the past year, artists, musicians, politicians, scholars, activists, and everyday people from many different walks of life, have universally raised profound questions on the possibility of bringing about this better world under an economic system of capitalism. The species' survival is in the balance, as economic greed and exploitation of the world's resources has led to the World Meteorological Organization's report yesterday of how the Earth has now passed the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere of 400 parts per million. It's been long known that so-called acceptable levels needed to be well below that level to avoid catastrophic climate change. 2016 is on record to become the hottest year on record. So it's with great pleasure and great urgency that we welcome our dear comrade and friend Rick Wolff, the country's preeminent Marxist economist, to the Radical Imagination. Welcome, Rick.
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. And tell us about your work recently, especially in the face of the ever-growing catastrophe of what global capitalism, American capitalism in particular, has become.
Well, I think it might give your viewers an insight into what's happening in this country, an insight not likely to be found in the mainstream media, if I tell you a little bit about what I do and the reception that I've found.
Yep.
Basically, my project has two parts. The first one is to open the space here in the United States for criticism of capitalism as a system. The reason that's a major project is that mostly for the last 50 years, there has been a suffocating taboo in the United States on speaking critically about capitalism. I once gave a graduate student of mine a little assignment. Go through the congressional record, that listing of what every senator and congressperson has ever said in a speech on the floor of either house, and find me a debate where there were the pros of capitalism on the one hand and the cons on the other. In other words, a discussion of the strengths and weaknesses of this economic system. The student came back after 4 or 5 weeks of effort and told me what I suspected, but now I knew. There is no such thing.
No debate.
No debate. We have debates in the Congress, but also in the public, debates over the education system we have and changes and weaknesses that it has, changes it needs, over the transportation system, over the medical insurance system, over the, you name it, we debate it, which is a healthy society's reaction to its institutions. Debate them, explore them, identify weaknesses, and make it better.
Also called a democracy, right?
Yes.
That's what you do, supposedly.
But there's one exception.
Yeah.
By the way, we're come to even debates what marriage is, and fundamental institutions are not exempt from this kind of question. But not capitalism. For 50 years, the Cold War, starting after World War II and running right up to the present, has made it virtually impossible for criticism of capitalism to get an airing, to get a public debate, for us even to talk about the strengths and weaknesses. What my student reported to me was, whenever capitalism as a system came up in the Congress, which it did, the two sides, Republican and Democrat, competed with one another to be more enthusiastic than the other one. It wasn't an analysis, it wasn't a debate, it was joint cheerleading that was going on. So we haven't had a debate about capitalism, its strengths and weaknesses. And that's a catastrophe for a country because it's an old rule. If you don't debate an institution that makes up your society, it rots. It allows the worst tendencies in that institution to flourish because there's a taboo on saying, hey, that's not a good thing that's happening. We need to deal with that. That doesn't happen when it's systemic.
And you went to the most preeminent graduate programs in the country.
Yes,
right?
I went to all the
didn't
schools.
happen there either, right?
No, not at all. When I went
Not at all there.
I went to school, I don't mind telling you, I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. Then I went to Stanford out in California to get my master's degree. And then I finished up and got my PhD at Yale. I'm like a poster boy for elite education. They all tried to convince me of how wonderful capitalism was, over and over and over again. There were one or two exceptions who had a little bit of criticism, but it was muted. It was only in the classroom by and large. And so those of us, and I was not the only one, who were dubious, who were skeptical, who thought we could see right away that capitalism had all kinds of problems, if we were interested in discussing those and learning about those, we had to do that on our own. One or two professors would help us, but the overwhelming consensus among the professors in all three schools was that capitalism is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and that any person who questions it or criticizes it is either ignorant and uneducated or has some evil political motive. And that's where the Cold War came in. What had happened was any criticism of capitalism was taken to mean you might be disloyal, you might like the Soviet Union, and then people stopped thinking and became all agitated. So one of the things I'm doing in my lifetime, and that is exploding now, is saying we've got to come out of 50 years of hibernation as a nation. Everywhere else, the debate between capitalism and socialism has in fact gone on. This is almost the only part of the world where it was shut down, repressed, quieted. And we have to catch up. Socialism has changed, capitalism has changed, the debates around them have changed. And part of my job is to reintegrate the United States into the worldwide discussion about capitalism as a system. Is it doing well? Is it falling apart? Is it dying? Is it benefiting only a tiny part of the population? Unfortunately, whether you like it or not, the answer to many of those questions is yes.
So you're starting with the basics.
Yes.
And you've got this incredible show, Democracy.
Economic Update.
Economic Update on what, 71?
71. It's a weekly hour-long program. It's on 71 stations across the United States. It's on 2 television stations where you see me on TV doing my radio show, one in Manhattan and the other one in the Bay Area in California. It's distributed every week by Truth Out. So we get to 1.5 million people every week. I started in March of 2011 with one station in New York, WBAI, and now we're on 71 stations. And the reason is very simple. There's an enormous hunger to catch up in this, to have this conversation about capitalism, to dare to ask whether this is a system not just serving a small portion of the population, but a system that's imploding on itself. And I think that this first half of my project is to be the guy who's out there, perhaps a bit more than others, out front with, here's some of the problems, here's some of the criticisms, here's the evidence to suggest that there's more than a little here that works, that's a good analysis. Don't be afraid. The way we make society better is to face its flaws, its weaknesses. We have a level of inequality in the United States that is staggering. Almost everybody admits it. Well, that's a product of capitalism. Wherever capitalism has been developed, it has produced growing inequality. Thomas Piketty issued a book a couple years ago that got a lot of attention, where he shows in 600 pages how and why, wherever capitalism has established itself for the last 300 years, it goes in the direction of greater inequality, and it keeps doing it unless and until people rise up and say we won't have it anymore. Then it gets reversed for a while, but the minute that stops, the underlying capitalist tendency resumes. That alone should be a basis for criticism.
Exactly. Get very basic just for a second for our audience here. Again, you say, how is it the basic foundation of capital? How does it bring it about at a basic level? So
Okay,
our
most
audience can
basic
really
level I
get-
can do is think of it this way. We've had other economic systems, not capitalism. For example, slavery. It organized production such that some people were masters and other people were slaves. The slaves did all the work, the masters got all the output. That's one way of organizing things. The masters told the slaves what to do.
Economic arrangement.
Yeah, it's an economic system.
Right.
Slavery, that's why we
Right.
give it a name.
Exactly.
That existed in various parts of the world, sometimes for decades, sometimes for centuries, and sometimes for millennia. Another one was feudalism. And feudalism is different. There are no masters, there are no slaves. Nobody can be the property of anybody else. You have lords and serfs. The lords tell everybody what to do, but the serfs have a bit of an autonomy to do their own thing, and they deliver a portion of the product of their labor to the lord in something we call, to this day, rent. So it's a system of lords and serfs. Capitalism is different again. It's not slavery, because nobody can own anybody. Right. It's not lords and serfs, or lords telling serfs what to, and everybody delivers rent. No, no, no. It's employer and employee. But that's not so different. The employer has in his hands or her hands all the power, all the decision making, and the employee, 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, shows up and does the work. And the name of the game is simple. The mass of people are workers, employees. The tiny minority are employers. The employers make the key decisions. The literal employer, the board of directors of a corporation. That's where most of us work in a capitalist system. The board of directors of most corporations, 15 to 20 people. They sit around. It's very important to understand this. They sit around and they decide what the enterprise will produce, how that production will be undertaken, where the production will be undertaken, and what will be done with the profits generated by the enterprise.
Obviously, no representation by the workers.
None.
Input at all.
It is the most undemocratic system imaginable. Now,
and a relatively new economic system. Right?
Relatively
it's only
new.
a few hundred years old, right?
and yes, it's 300 years old. Started in England, spread to Western Europe, to North America, Japan, and now the whole world. But in a capitalist enterprise, it is a fundamentally not only undemocratic, it's anti-democratic. A tiny group of people decide whether you continue to work or not. Decide what you do 9 to 5, 5 days a week. That's the bulk of your adult life, that you're a working person for most of us. So a tiny group of people decided. At the end of the year, there's typically a Christmas party where the employer gets up on a chair if he hasn't drunk too much and gives a speech thanking everybody for the work they did to produce that year's lucky profit output, right? The irony of it all is, as soon as he gives the speech, tumbles down off the chair, everybody goes back to having their Christmas drinks, but who decides what to do with the profit everybody helped to produce? It's not everybody. It's that tiny group of people. Now, who picks those people? The shareholders. Well, 1% of shareholders own 2/3 of the shares. So there's your 1%. They decide who's on the board of directors because they have the shares. And the only way you pick the board of directors is by voting 1 share, 1 vote. So if you got 10 shares from your grandma, you get 10 votes. If you're Citibank and you hold for wealthy people 2 million shares, you get 2 million votes. So the answer is obvious. The 1% control the enterprises. And here comes now the conclusion of capitalism, which brings it all, I think, into focus. If you allow a tiny group of people answerable to nobody else to make the decisions...
But the so-called market, which is a figment of imagination too, right?
But
we'll get into that, okay.
Yeah, the truth of the matter is the shareholders, the 1% who own most of the shares, elect the board of directors, and the board of directors decides what to produce, how to produce, where to produce, and what to do with the profits. That board of directors is a tiny number of people. The mass of workers is an immense number of people. And here comes the conclusion. If you allow that tiny group of people to make all the key decisions, they make the decisions that serve them.
course.
And they sacrifice everybody else. That's why the people who sit on boards of directors, the chief executive officers of many of these corporations, et cetera, that's why they earn 10, 20, 30, 40 million dollars a year, and the average person can't pay for their kid to go to college without loading up on 50 grand in debt. You shouldn't be surprised. A system is organized, it benefits the few. You go to the south of the America and you see the leftover historical plantations. A mass of people doing the work and a tiny number of people sitting in the plantation house. You go to a chateau in France, you see a magnificent building where people live. But what you don't remember, perhaps, is that there were 20,000 serfs in the surrounding 20 square miles.
That
providing the food. That's right.
Could live.
That's right. So you had massive people produce. Capitalism isn't different that way.
So why don't we get this? I mean, you're okay. That's part of your project. That
project
people
is,
will get it. We'll begin to open up to the discussion, right?
It's even more basic.
Okay.
My project is this.
Yeah.
Every system the human race has so far used to produce the goods and services it needs was born, evolved over time, and died. Mm-hmm. Slavery did that. Feudalism did that. Ancient tribal arrangements did that. North American native tribe villages did that. Capitalism, we're not supposed to believe it will die too. Every other system did. And the minute you recognize that systems have a history, a birth, a growth, and a death, then you must ask the question, unless you're a strange thinking person, well, are we at the death? Is the death coming?
How do we know it? What do we measure that by? Yeah.
But at least we have to be open to the fact that a system like this, that is destroying us in our relationship with nature, destroying us in the inequality that sets us against each other, destroying us by an instability. Capitalism is one of the most unstable systems in the world. We've had 2 collapses of the system in the last 75 years. The first one, the 1930s, the worst ever. The second one since 2008. And it only ranks second because we're not done yet. We'll see in the years to come. A system that breaks down in a fundamental global way twice in 75 years. 75 years is not much in historical time. That ought to raise a question.
And
but
the
it's worse
patient was saved by
the government bailing them out.
By the government and
the very institution that the leaders of private enterprise like to make fun of, like to reject.
Except when they really need them in the crunch.
Then they beg to be bailed out, and they are bailed out because, of course, they are the power behind the throne of capitalist governments.
Reluctantly. Some reluctantly go along with it, right? Some do. I mean, well, tell us about the New Deal and then bring us up more up to date.
Yeah, well,
and how capitalism saved itself through what you would say, right, is it's still liberal policies, but that never really destroyed the fundamental master-slave relationship, as you're saying.
Right. Well, and the great
that was what makes you really
different from some of the other folks.
Okay.
That's right.
Okay.
I don't think capitalism is the greatest thing since sliced bread. I do think it is in an extremely difficult trouble right now. I don't know whether it can extract itself. It has extracted itself from previous collapses, that's true. On the other hand, every system dies, and I don't see any reason, none, why capitalism shall live forever strikes me as the same naivete as might affect an individual who imagines at various moments in his or her life that they will live forever. It's kind of cute, but you don't take it seriously.
Right.
All right.
The crisis will get worse and worse.
It can.
It can.
Well, maybe they'll find a way out.
Somehow.
Let's talk about the 1930s when they did, right?
Okay.
The 1930s was a worse collapse than the one we have now. Starts in October of 1929 and is officially listed to have lasted about 1941, so 11 to 12 years. Between 1929 when it starts and 1933, it got continuously worse and worse. In 1933, for example, the official unemployment rate was 25%, 5 times what it is today. A catastrophic collapse of production, of jobs, tens of thousands of businesses collapsed, tens of millions of people lost their jobs. because the people weren't working and the businesses weren't functioning, nobody paid taxes, which meant the city governments and the state governments and the federal government had no money. So at the same time that you lost your job, the community had less resources with which to provide you with public services to help you. The crazy capitalist system making the government, which is supposed to help you when you have a difficulty, impoverished just at the moment when the economy forces you to have the greatest need. This would be a Rube Goldberg type of invention if you were willing to be jocular and humorous about a system with such obvious flaws. But the important thing about the 1930s was that the American people reacted differently from the way they reacted to this one. They got angry. They got determined not to suffer. They didn't resign themselves. They didn't make excuses to one another why nothing could be done, which is a rather more of what we've been doing the last few years. What did they do? Three things of great importance. Number one, the biggest one, millions of Americans joined labor unions. They thought that was the best way to hold on to their job, to hold on to their income, to get government services that were being cut back. They decided to do that. These were people who had never been in a union before and whose parents had never been in a union. So this was an act of volition, an act of figuring this is the best thing for me to do.
Transformative energy.
Right.
Yeah.
And more people joined unions than had ever done it before in American history or have ever done it since. It is the heyday, the high point, the explosive success of the labor movement, led by the CIO and its leader at the time, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, who took the initiative. The second thing Americans did in the depths of the Depression, when capitalism clearly wasn't working and everybody knew it, was to join two socialist and one communist party here in the United States. And the communists and socialists worked together with the trade unions, often being the militants who did the organizing to help bring all these people in the union. And the bottom line was a coalition emerged. Communists, socialists, and labor union, trade unionists. And they went to the president, Roosevelt, a kind of namby-pamby, middle-of-the-road guy who had campaigned for president on a balanced budget, very conservative idea. And they went to him and they said, Mr. Roosevelt, we voted for you, but we are a powerful and well-organized coalition of millions of Americans, communists, socialists, and CIO unionists. And you've got to do something to help the people in the Great Depression. We are suffering. It's the system that's not working, and we want you to help. And the unspoken message, although they might have said it outside in the hallway, if you don't, we're not going to vote for you again, and you're not going to be the president much longer. And the socialists and communists added the other point, and if you don't do something, there'll be a revolution in this country. And wow, then there'll be
Real
you know
blood in
what.
the streets.
Right.
Where were the academic economists there? Were they part of this
most
narrative at all?
economists, you have to remember,
were
before
advising.
World War II, academic life was dominated by private schools. That is, the majority of students went to a private college, a private university. Yeah. It cost a lot of money, which meant that really only the wealthier people's children went. They were not proposed to be critical of a system which, after all, had made them wealthy. There were some exceptions. The City University of New York existed and was free at the time, but that was very rare. Very few parts of America had anything like it. The state universities were small at that time, relatively speaking, and they too tended to take people from the upper parts of the society income-wise. So you didn't get much of a left-wing academic. Some, but not a great deal. Okay. They were not leaders in this process. They were, if anything, caboose came at the end. Let's get back to the story. What did Roosevelt do when he was confronted by these people? He went to the rich and the corporations, people he knew because he was one of them, came from that family. His relative had already been a president a while back, so he was part of it. He said to them, look, I just had this meeting with these folks, and he told them what happened. And he said, look, we have got to do something for the mass of people or else. And it's worse, he said to these wealthy corporations and wealthy individuals. In order to do what these people want us to do for them, I don't have the money as the president. The government has no money because everybody's unemployed, because the businesses are defunct, nobody can pay taxes. There's no revenue. We have to help them, but the government can't. There's only one, looking right at them, he said, there's only one place where I can go to get the money to do for the mass of people. I've got to take it from you. Looking right at them. Well, they went ballistic, as you can imagine. Half of them never bought this argument. They didn't want to do anything. No, 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 no. Those are the people whose descendants are the Koch brothers and folks like that. But the other half of the business community, the rich, they understood exactly what Mr. Roosevelt was telling them. And in the words of Kennedy, the father of John Kennedy, who came later, he says, I like Roosevelt because he made it clear we better give him some money or else we won't have any money to give anybody ever again.
And the deal, of course, was that they would still maintain their master status, even with
the crucial thing was Roosevelt would tax them big time, which he did. He taxed the rich, he taxed the corporations. And he told them, what I don't take from you in taxes, you're going to lend to me. You're going to give me a loan. Okay. But between the taxes I take and the loans you give, I'm going to take care of the people, which I'll explain in a minute what he did. But what he never did, and this is your correct point, he never took from them the power. He let them, he said, you can stay in control. It's your business, it's your enterprise. You will be in charge. You won't lose it. And that way I can take care of the people, and that way there won't be the revolution that might take you and separate you from your business. I'll let you stay. He went back to the socialists, communists, and unions, and he said, I got a deal for you. I'm going to take better care of you than you thought I would. But no more conversation about revolution, no more conversation about taking the enterprises away from them. That's the deal. Let them stay, and we'll take care of you. The communists, the socialists, and the unions, with some exceptions, bought the deal. And the bulk of the business community, with some exceptions, bought the deal. That's all Roosevelt did. And then he went to work. He taxed them, he took their loans from them, he made them do it, and then he used the money to create the Social Security system, which we never had before. In the middle of a depression, when the government has no money, it announces, we're giving everybody who's 65 years of age or older a check every month for the rest of their life. As soon as that was done, he created the unemployment compensation system. We never had that before either. To the tens of millions of people unemployed, then he said, I'm going to give you a check every week for 20, 40, 60 weeks to help you out. Number 3, the first minimum wage we ever had in the United States passed so that people had a decent life. And the 4th and the biggest, jobs. Yes, he said if the private sector either cannot or will not provide work to the millions of Americans who ask for nothing other than to be given a job, then there's no alternative, he said, as if it were the most normal thing in the world for me to do it as president. And between 1934 and 1941, he created and filled roughly 15 million jobs. People who had, therefore, their self-esteem back, who had a job, who had an income, who could therefore make their mortgage payments and keep their house, all of it.
Keep the system going.
Kept the system. Absolutely. The irony was, it kept the system going by helping the mass of people. Right. The very things which, since 2008, we don't do. We haven't had an upsurge of the unions taking a politically powerful position. The unions keep shrinking. We have no socialist and communist parties with any real influence left, so they're gone. So we don't have the mass of people asking for or getting anything like this. To tell you how bad it is, Obama, Clinton, nothing about a public jobs program. The program that worked so well the last time we had this problem disappears from these stunning leader types.
But then you have an insurgent Sanders campaign.
Well, you have the reaction to the failure.
To the failures, okay. The non-response.
It turns out that there are people who have some historical memory. Okay. There are people, even if they don't know the story, can figure out, my goodness, we can do better than this. Yeah. And Bernie is the first politician who comes forward after a hibernation of half a century to say, oh, by the way, I'm a socialist. And while it's vague and a little fuzzy how he does that, it's nonetheless at least some way of saying, I'm not in the cheerleading section for capitalism because it's obvious this system is not working for all but a tiny number of the people in this society, which is a message I deliver all over the country to an audience which is now huge, which
Very
already
receptive.
believes it.
Believes
Of
it.
course.
Exactly.
And not because I'm persuasive, because
You are.
life
Give me some, but
life is teaching them.
They see what's right.
People
before them.
say, how do you
Yeah.
go about organizing? And the answer is, I don't. Capitalism
Conditions
is
are there
organizing.
to organize the people. Yeah.
Capitalism is organizing its own critics.
Right.
Or to quote a leader from many years ago who saw this, capitalism digs its own grave. It doesn't need, at best, I'm making it explicit, but a lot of people don't need, they like what they hear from me, but mostly because it validates their own understanding that life is teaching them because their kids have debts they cannot pay, because the quality of their work situation has deteriorated, their job has fewer benefits, their job has less security, their job is paying them less. A lot of the people who lost their jobs in 2008 and 9 and 10 have no job today, or if they have gotten a job, it is without the benefits and at lower salary than they got before. The deterioration, the gap between rich and poor, it's everywhere.
And mass incarceration and the drug war being used as vehicles to
Or
take
a
that surplus
society
population.
that has these kinds of fundamental economic problems generates two major candidates who act like there is no systematic problem. This is, we'll do this, and they propose things that are trivial, that probably won't pass, and even if they did, are way too small to deal. It's a doctor who comes in, hears that there's a diagnosis of cancer, and starts rummaging around in his desk for the right Band-Aid to use. What?
So Bernie didn't stick to his guns, or he didn't carry the fight strongly enough, more radically enough. Is that, or else he might have been?
I don't want to second guess.
Okay, but
I don't want to second guess Bernie Sanders. What I will say
I
to
understand, but
he gets the credit for opening this. It is
okay.
Until Bernie did that, any politician to whom one could legitimately or otherwise attach the name socialist, thereby, if they didn't renounce that on the spot, they thereby committed political suicide. End of it. Bernie showed that that's no longer the case. By Bernie saying, yeah, I'm a socialist, big deal. And it was. And millions of Americans could care less, voted for him with enthusiasm. Either they didn't know or they didn't care. But the destructive use of socialism as a kind of eradication of your career, that's over. And all of us left of center in this country, whether we like Bernie particularly or
It's a
not,
huge step.
owe him an enormous debt.
Absolutely.
Now, he made decisions to stay within the Democratic Party. A lot of people don't like that. I understand both those positions. I assume for Bernie it was a strategic and tactical decision. His socialism, if you know much about the history of socialism, is of the most moderate and most limited sort. There's a whole range of socialist positions, and he is on the least revolutionary, if you like.
Where do you place yourself in your own work and activism?
For me, most of what the things that Bernie suggests are what we call social democratic reforms.
Okay. They
make capitalism less unequal. They make capitalism less unstable.
palatable.
But they leave the basic system functioning. Their socialism, you might say, Europeans say this often, they're the kind of socialisms who want capitalism with a human face, a welfare state, a proper support for the people that capitalism has no jobs for, a proper support for young children that shouldn't be victimized economically by the family they happen to be born into.
Guaranteed annual income?
Yes, guaranteed. Those are all ways you leave the system.
Which you don't necessarily disapprove.
No. I'm in
but
favor.
You're talking about in your many books here. We brought 3 of them, the more recent ones. Workers' cooperative. This is
I want a system that is not messing up the mass of people's lives for years, only then to come in with a palliative, with a reform program that makes the destruction less awful. All right, so that we have people that are way too poor, we'll give them an earned income tax credit to help them, give them back $1,000 after we have ripped them off for 25 times that.
Right.
That's not my idea of how to solve a problem. Help people through to have a few lower debts for college.
Yeah.
What are we making debts be part of the penance you have to pay for an education?
No, I got you.
For
Yeah,
me,
makes sense.
for me, the question is, and I think this is the question for this program and really defines my project. The question is, can we do better than capitalism? And the answer is to look hard at the strengths and weaknesses of capitalism. It has both. And if the weaknesses are pervasive, are systemic, then to go and where our brains lead to. Can we do better? And my answer is yes, we can. And I know what, in my head, where to go. And the way to go is simple once you get it. The reason capitalism doesn't work for the mass of people is that the mass of people are excluded from running it. And the reason the system serves a 1% or 5%, whatever you want to put it, is because those are the people in charge.
So that's why
You know,
we have
we got rid of
democracy at work here.
Yeah, if you want the system economically to serve the mass of people, you got to put the mass of people in charge. You know, we decided several centuries ago, the we being, let's say, Western European society, we decided to get rid of monarchy, of kings. Sometimes we did it peacefully, sometimes not so peacefully. And that was because we couldn't tolerate anymore having a tiny group of people, the king and the royal, this and that, making the decisions, war and peace, taxing us, ruining the countryside, stealing the money. We didn't want that. We said, no, we think we'll be better off if those kinds of decisions are dispersed, if everybody has a vote over who will be in the political leadership positions to make those decisions. People who can be voted out if we don't like the decisions they make. We democratized politics. Well, if you don't want unstable economic systems, inequality on a scale that is mind-bending, the injustice that goes with it, you've got to do the same thing. You've got to democratize the workplace, just like we democratized the residential place where we live. We vote. Well, why shouldn't you have a business that runs as follows? Every person in there, the assembly line worker, the secretary, the supervisor, whoever, one person, one vote. Let's sit there, let's have a discussion. What do we want this enterprise to do? All of us democratically make the decision and work out a democratic relationship with the communities. Because we, the people who work in the workplace, we also live in the community. The democracy we have in the community goes nicely with a democracy in the workplace. They should be parallel, interactive democracies. That's, if you're committed to democracy, which America claims.
Right.
If we're fighting wars now in 5 countries to bring them democracy, we've got to face an unhappy truth. We don't have democracy. And not in the workplace, which is where most of us spend most of our lives. 5 out of 7 days, the best hours of the day, we're at work. If you're committed to democracy, that's the first place it should have been institutionalized. Instead, we've never had it institutionalized there. We allow a tiny group of people to run it, and then we're surprised that they become fabulously rich and the rest of us don't. I mean, this is childish on a certain level. The worker co-op is a way to institutionalize. And let me give you an example. Suppose the question were, as it has been in America for 40 years, do we close the factory in New York or Chicago or Pittsburgh and move to China? Well, a tiny group of people at the top say yes, because we can pay workers in China way less than we have to pay Americans. So bye-bye, we're leaving. Abandoned city, desperate finances of the city, desperate families with no jobs. Well, suppose that decision wasn't made by the board of directors. Suppose a democracy of all the people working there had made the decision. Do you think they'd destroy their own jobs, their own communities, their own incomes, and go to China?
Of course not.
The whole issue's gone. It's just gone. They would say, we've got to solve the problems we have as an enterprise in other ways. That's not available.
How do people respond to the fact that capitalism has become so much more dynamic globally? So you're dealing with a much larger set of
Even if I could,
countries, even and
if I could,
people.
if
Yeah,
I could
go ahead.
challenge you, Jim,
Please.
using a word like dynamic,
Yeah. Okay. That
you know,
was-
makes me nervous because it has a kind of glow to it. I want to tarnish the glow.
Okay. Go right ahead.
Capitalism isn't dynamic. What capitalism
Expansive.
is, well, even that is wrong.
Okay.
Capitalism is cheap. And let me explain. What capitalism has done is abandoned. Let me be blunt with you. It's abandoned the United States. It's abandoned Western Europe. It's in the process of abandoning Japan too. It's leaving. It's not because it's dynamic. It's leaving to go to where the wages are cheap and the profits
That's what I
correspondingly
meant more the
higher.
dynamics of
Well,
it,
but
of
let's
attempting to maximize profits.
right. But the result is, let me give you as an example, Detroit.
Right.
35, 40 years ago, Detroit has 2 million people. It's the center of a successful automotive-based capitalism. It is so dynamic, African Americans can become part of the well-paid working class in a way they were normally excluded from. Okay, presidents take foreign visitors from Washington and fly to Detroit to see. The world culture is changed because of fantastic new music, the Motown sound, emerges out of the culture that economic system sustains. Now fast forward to today. The population of Detroit today, 700,000. The majority of the people, 1.3 million out of 2, driven out of the city. No work, no job, no income. Half the houses, if you drive through Detroit, are abandoned. Half of them are burnt to the ground. It's a wasteland, and it's not alone. Cleveland, my hometown, Youngstown, Ohio, these are towns decimated, destroyed, semi-ghost town. Capitalism isn't dynamic.
It's
Capitalism,
immoral, is what you're saying.
well,
in that sense,
you can.
these are moral issues as well.
They're also moral issues, but capitalism isn't interested in morality. Never has been. It's going where the profits are high. The kinds of conditions created in China are horrible. The kinds of conditions in Bangladesh or in India or in Brazil, awful. This is not capitalism going somewhere else to behave better. It's going there in part because it can behave less well. It doesn't have to observe environmental limits. It doesn't have to observe rules of how you treat human beings. The scandals, the collapse of buildings, the fires. It's going back to the primitive capitalism we struggled so hard in the West to overcome is being recreated. This is a capitalism that puts profit as the bottom line and doesn't care who it destroys or where, and that Americans tolerate this, accept this, allow for the people who are at the top and already the richest to become that much more richer by going to another. It is stupefying. You wonder why millions of Americans will vote for Trump. It has to do with the fact that he at least makes an issue of it. Granted, his solutions are largely absurd and non-workable, but again, at least he is sympathetic.
Acknowledges some
Yes.
of that pain.
Whereas Obama and Mrs. Clinton seem to want us to believe that the economic crisis of capitalism isn't there, that we're in the midst of a lovely recovery. This is,
Fantasy world.
yeah, Trump has a fantasy of how to solve it, and Clinton has a fantasy that there's nothing to solve. I mean, this is stupefying that a society in this level of difficulty puts that kind of choice toward its own people. That's a sign of denial. That's a sign of head in the sand. I don't want to know it. I don't want to see it. It's like a little child, 3 years old, who thinks that the way you get rid of the scary monster is to put your hands in front of your eyes, because if you can't see it, it's not there. But you're supposed to outgrow that by the time you're, I don't know, 6 or 7. And we as a culture and as a politics, we're so unused to criticizing capitalism, to exploring real alternatives like a democratization of the workplace or a worker co-op would allow us to do, that people like me have to say hello and be a little bit like the boy in the famous Emperor New Clothes or Emperor No Clothes. You know, the emperor's going by, isn't he lovely? And the little child says, excuse me, and he's not wearing anything. So I'm saying, you know, capitalism is wonderful, dynamic. No, it isn't. Capitalism is a system that is not working now for the mass of people. And usually, not always, but usually a system as glaringly unsuccessful for the mass of people, is not long for its survival.
And you see the end coming of almost
I think that
inevitably.
well,
or the contradictions are so
since I think
strong.
that I think that death is part of life.
Right. We're seeing an
Then
economic
capitalism is alive, no question. Maybe alive for a long time. I can't predict the future any better than anybody else can.
and to prop itself up, might come up with all kinds of
It's tried,
wars,
but it's running out.
and mass incarceration,
Yeah.
drug wars, and all kinds of things like
But
that.
we already have, we're fighting at least 4 wars that I can count now. If you count Iraq, Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia and Libya, I mean, it gets messy.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're fighting a lot of wars which we really can't afford. We are distressing an enormous number of our working class, a majority of the people. We're putting young people trying to get a college education into an impossible economic and personal bind. If you add up the number of people in our society for whom this system doesn't work, if I were a defender of this system, I would be very worried. And you know, you do not successfully keep a system like this going with police and the military. It's too expensive.
Security apparatus
And
surveillance. and
all
so
it
on,
does
yeah.
is widen the gap.
Yeah.
Make more mistakes, make more people
More
bitter.
anger, yeah.
You know, we keep bombing Afghanistan. We're not winning there. We're losing. We keep doing it in Iraq. We create enemies by each effort we make to. It doesn't work. And at some point, my guess is the military have told the political leaders, but the political leaders can't take the fallout from being, nobody wants to be the president who says, it didn't work, we blew it. So it continues, but it doesn't work.
Same thing going on with the police too and the criminal justice. But leave us with a couple of positive examples of what you were referring to. Yes, good, very good. In the
Worker co-ops.
Workers' co-ops.
That's,
okay.
I'm going to leave you with that.
Please.
It's a movement whose time has come. The idea of workers cooperatively owning and operating their enterprises is thousands of years old. It's not new. It has not. I'm not the originator, inventor, discoverer, or anything. What I'm doing is finding that this institution, which human beings have hungered for, moved toward, made experiments with, has now come into a situation where it can become the dominant economic form because it responds to, it answers problems that the capitalist system has that it is showing it cannot solve. We have been talking, for example, about the growing inequality as a problem in America. We can go back to Michael Harrington in the 1960s, who writes that famous book. We can talk about the Great Society of Lyndon Johnson. We can talk about Kennedy's programs. We had a lot of programs. It doesn't work. The inequality getting worse. The programs of capitalism to solve the inequality produced by capitalism is failing. We've tried since capitalism was born to control its instability, its crazy business cycles. We failed at that. We've had the worst one in the 1930s and the second worst one in capitalist history is right now. Right. It's a failure. It can't solve its problems. Meanwhile, worker co-ops become more and more attractive because they wouldn't permit, they wouldn't go in the directions capitalism has done. They wouldn't create many of the problems capitalism has, and it would solve many of the problems capitalism
can't. And could become the dominant economic form.
It already is happening.
It is.
For example, I'll end with the most successful one. In 1956, in the poor country of Spain, in the north, the Basque area. Basque people are Spanish, but they have their own culture, their own language. They live in the Pyrenees Mountains that separate Spain from France. A Catholic priest, Father Arizmendi, 1956, gives a famous talk to his parishioners. He says, if we wait for capitalists to come here and employ us, we will all die of old age before it happens. So let's not wait. Let's become our own employers. Or in other words, let's set up a co-op where we are both the workers and the employers. That's what a co-op is.
We've got 1 minute, unfortunately.
All right, very quickly.
Quickly, yeah.
Fast forward to today. Mondragon is a family of 200 co-ops. It is the 7th largest corporation in all of Spain. It is wildly successful. It is a demonstration that worker co-ops can last, can grow, can become big, and can outcompete capitalist firms. 2 American companies have shared research scientists with Mondragon, Microsoft and General Motors. They understand the power of co-ops, even if the mass of the American people still have to learn about them.
Absolutely. And we need to learn a lot more. Many in our audience want to learn more about you. Again, how can they reach you?
Very simply, we maintain 2 websites, rdwolff with 2fs.com and democracyatwork.info. Everything you want to know about us, it's all on those 2 websites, democracyatwork.info and rdwolff with 2fs.com.
And you have a new book coming out?
Yes, the new book just published this year. Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Haymarket 2016.
Terrific. Rick, thank you so very, very much for being on.
Thank you, Jim.
We'll see you again very soon. One of the major forces and influences for me and this show, and for countless others around the world, passed on this last Sunday, October 23rd. He was and is the epitome of what we're trying to do on this show, trying to create an alternative narrative for memory, meaning, and action, one that you can hear Rick Wolff talk about as well. One that has as its mission social, racial, sexual, and economic justice, an end to violence and militarism, patriarchy, racism, sexism, ecological devastation, and the creation of a more humane, nurturing, and caring world of radical love, fun, hope, and joy. He was not part of the left that sometimes can become authoritarian and rigidly dogmatic. Criticized by some on the left as becoming too pragmatic and accommodating in his later life to electoral establishment politics, his ideals, thought, and activism were firmly rooted in a non-authoritarian tradition. His was about more and more democracy, as Rick was talking about. Participatory democracy, democracy at work. Because of his illness after a stroke a year ago, we had set up, but had to unfortunately cancel 3 different appearances where he was to be on the Radical Imagination. The last one just 3 weeks ago. Tom Hayden will be dearly and profoundly missed. Let me leave you with a Christmas card Tom sent out 3 years ago. It gives you his depths of love, thoughtfulness, wit, and American sense, Irish American sense of irony, fun, and universal goodwill. And this is the card. When Pope Francis is the left wing of the world, I say, God damn it. Celebrate Christmas and the risen Jesus. I know Francis has a ways to go on certain issues, but denouncing the fundamentalist obsession with sex and gender is a start. What we often think is lost is found. If the church of the poor is rising, can a party of the poor be far behind? If Latin America is lifting the Pope, is that not good tidings for the immigrant? If the Pope takes the name of Francis, does that not mean that the earth and universe are consecrated? I don't mean to preach to you, brothers and sisters, but it's that time of year when the Spirit is born where least expected. Have courage, gain wisdom, laugh at the powerful, spread love, rant when necessary, raise your fists, organize, and keep Lucifer at bay, or at least out of office. If Francis can be Pope, anything is possible. Tom. This is Jim Vredos. See you next week on The Radical Imagination.
These illegal drugs in terms of the public education has just been lies. The fact is, what we know is that there are positive effects associated with people using a drug like crack.
And I got involved with the Coalition of Immokalee Workers by attending their weekly meetings and their other gatherings that they have in the community of Immokalee, which is made up of workers that pick all sorts of crops that are grown in Southwest Florida, from tomatoes, oranges, cucumbers, and other things.
The Mars show or whatever, that religion is a belief in some kind of magical super being who sits on a cloud or sits somewhere and takes worries about whether you've fornicated, and if you're good and ask them for things, I mean, it's this kind of child's version.
Distant you are from the realities of the problems, the more somehow deep and profound your scholarship, which is far from the truth. The reality is that the whole reason for education, the whole reason for theory, the whole reason for scholarship is to resolve and improve life.
A vigorous state action for that to happen.
Absolutely.
And stepping on a lot of toes
Yeah.
to get there.
Right.
And she is certainly not the one to do that. And I thought for half a minute that maybe Obama might step in that direction. There's some half-decent stuff in the first stimulus bill, and that was the end of it.
Right.
And he's done a couple of things in environmental regulations in the last year or so that, okay. But,
Agree with what they're saying. I have to say that Black Lives Matter is a decentralized structure, and it's got state sanctions, right? We are operating state by state, and we understand what needs to be changed in our states, but we have this ideology, this common ideology, and we are also invested in nonviolence.
Show of the Radical Imagination. I am so happy to have had you here.